Kroog died on a crimson morning. To Sunwell, it sounded like a festival day. Only the crowds cheered in a minor key, and the booms and reports were not fireworks exploding, and the smoke rising over the city stank of burning industry and steaming bricks. It was almost the same. The Orneary's main yard was abuzz with activity. Technicians and artificers sprinted back and forth, hauling anti-armor bolts, power stones and adventure swords. Stompers and other automatons waited in ready ranks, crowding the plaza. Piles of ammunition, spare parts and other materials stood in hasty stacks. The 5 student pilots and their instructor stood in front of the canvas-covered supplies, facing a rank of old, refurbished Avengers. The morning sun hung low and hot in the sky, burning away the rest of the night's blood-warm rain. Sunwell, at attention, swayed, lightheaded. His stomach lurched, and he retched on the hot brick between his boots. "Pilot Sunwell, you will tighten up your constitution," Laura shouted. The cadet's instructor was red-faced and stern, dressed in a crisp and clean uniform despite the early hour and hurried muster. "Sorry, ma'am," Sunwell said. He spat the last of his sick out onto the hot stone plaza and wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. He had nothing to cough up but water and nerves. The attack had come before breakfast. "You good, son?" Rika muttered. Sunwell's face burned with embarrassment. Rika stood unwavering at his side, as stoic as if he was carved from the red brick of Kroog itself. "Fine," Sunwell said. He wanted to die. "I think I had something sour last night." Rika did not answer. The warning bells of Kroog ran out across the city. The sound of churned Sunwell's stomach almost as much as Rika's stiff non-acknowledgement. "I'm worried about my brother," Sunwell said. "Randall is in the capital proper. He's a flyer. He's not cut out for fighting." "Eyes forward," Laura barked, interrupting Sunwell's one-sided conversation with Rika. The old Sawardi paced before the short line of Avenger trainees, staring at each one in turn. The woman was tough as new leather and harsh as the lime that cured it, thin as a reed and sharp as a needle. Sunwell felt faint. He was dipping into metaphor, he realized, to get away from the moment. "You 5 cadets," Laura began, "have the honor of being the only ground pounders in the city capable of crewing an adventure while keeping your head on your shoulders." Laura pointed to the ground beneath her boots. "You are being caught up, boys. Training is over. Today's the day you save Kroog." Someone looked between his own boots at the crimson bricks, neatly laid in spiraling star patterns. That had taken some getting used to for Sunwell. The Yoshians decorated everything. It meant everything from cooking to construction took a little bit longer, but to young Sunwell that was worth it. In Kroog, as in much of Yosha, even the streets were art, unlike the stoic blocks of his native Penragon. Sunwell could walk with his head low or eyes up, and either way he would find a little majesty. It was as a city should be, Sunwell came to think, full of little wonders, plainly hidden delights, all watched over by mighty triumphs. Was he ready to fight to defend it? Not a theoretical question. Laura had just leaned in, face to face, to ask him. Sunwell blinked and wavered. "I said," Laura growled, "are you ready to fight for Kroog?" Yes I am," Sunwell said. "Yes ma'am," Laura corrected Sunwell. "You're on the line now, Sunwell. No more training, no more practice. You ready to fight?" "Yes ma'am," Sunwell said louder. Laura nodded. "Show me," she said. She pressed the slim device into Sunwell's hand and stepped back. The 4 other students, pilots, Sunwell corrected. Mentality. Change your mind, change reality. You're now a pilot. The 4 other pilots walked toward Laura, taking up relaxed but attentive positions behind the instructor. Sunwell took the handheld device, a command rod, but a new model, and checked it. It was the length of his forearm, edged on one end for grip, tapered ever so slightly at the smooth opposite end. A small tactile switch rested under his thumb when he held the rod. Sunwell thumbed the rod on, and the soft hum warmed the tool. A toggle and a trigger rested under his pointer and ring fingers. More controls. Samuel flipped the toggle and listened to the slight change in the rod's pitch. He pointed the rod at his hand, pulled the trigger, and saw the brief flash of light on his palm. "Check," Samuel said. He raised the command rod, stopped. Ma'am?" he said to Laura. "Which unit am I paired to?" Laura pointed her chin. "That one." Samuel turned, his jaw dropped. A new, shining Avenger, one of the sword-patterned prototypes, still curled on its transport sledge. Samuel had only seen the plans for them, passed around the mess during meals. They were larger, lighter, faster, more powerful, unkillable, the artificers bragged. The best they've made to date. Behind this Avenger waited 4 more. Technicians and artificers hurried to clear the packing debris. Straw canvas sheets, leather pads and protective oils from the waiting machines, preparing them for activation. Samuel grinned, nerves momentarily suppressed by excitement. "You'll find these sword patterns much more intuitive than the units you've been trained with." "Even for prototypes," Laura said. Samuel thought he could hear the pride in his instructor's voice. "What's its name?" Samuel asked Laura. "Sword 1, Laura said. Samuel raised his command rod and clicked the transmit button. The rod pitched up. "Sword 1, at attention." Sword 1 unfolded, standing from its sledge. The machine was humanoid, around 15 feet tall at the shoulder. The prototype Avenger looked to Samuel like a lithe knight animated by magic fire. A mirror-polished cuirass covered its central power core, exhaust apertures fluttering, venting excess heat from its thoracic power plant. The roar of its power core sent a rush through Samuel. This was power, and it awaited his command. "Sword 1, Samuel spoke firm and clear, as he had been trained. The command rods themselves were little wonders, able to pick out its operator's voice through the chaos of battle or a crowd. At the ready. The Avenger moved in a fluid, silent twist to a low, steady stance, positioning one manipulator on the hilt of its primary blade, the other out for balance. Samuel rocked backward, hair tousled by the rush of air displaced by the speed of Sword 1's maneuver. "Sword 1, draw and guard." Sword 1 drew its primary blade, whipping it into a medium guard, one manipulator on the blade shaft to guide it and stabilize against incoming attacks. The blade was larger than a person, 8 feet long and a foot wide at the base. Like its cuirass, it was polished to a mirror shine and caught the sun, flashing as it moved. Samuel could not suppress his excitement. With one of these, they could turn the tide. With 5, he raised the rod one last time. "Sword 1, to me." The Avenger darted towards Samuel, stopping in a defensive crouch above him, sword at the ready. "Good work, Samuel," a different speaker. Samuel turned and saw Thanos, Ursa's chief apprentice, standing with Laura and the other pilots. "Sir," Samuel saluted. He double-keyed the command rod and, as with the older stompers, Sword 1 dropped its defensive stance, resting at ease. "I see you are acquainted with our new model already," Thanos said. He spoke with a smile, though Samuel read through the chief apprentice's brave face. "It's a dream, Chief," Samuel said. "Movement fidelity feels 1-to-1. How did Ursa do it?" "Later, son," Thanos said. He was breathless, as if he had just stopped from a run. Samuel realized that was probably the case. The cause for this promotion was not a happy one. Kroog was under attack. He walked over the group of students and fell in line with them. "You 5 are the best of our student corps," Thanos said, addressing Samuel, Rika and the others. "Laura here has told me that each of you possess the skills, temperament and cleverness necessary to command our sword pattern Avengers, and so it is with great pride that I hereby officially promote you to full pilots." The cadets looked to each other with excitement over having their promotions confirmed, and by Ursa's own assistant no less. "We can't go through the usual ceremony right now, nor can we bother with unit placement," Thanos said. He hunched slightly as he spoke, apologetic, a stiff formality about his presentation. He really meant it. Samuel thought he really was sorry there could not be any ceremony about the day. Samuel's heart swelled. Ursa may have been the brilliant one, but Thanos was really nearly as smart. And he cared. That made all the difference. Kroog is under attack, Thanos said. The first waves of Mishra's force have crossed the Mardoon. They control the river wards. The spearhead of their attack is a detachment of dragon engines, large automatons, capable of breathing fire. We believe them to be unpiloted. Students, pilots, Samuel reminded himself, for real this time, exchanged worried looks. Rika, Samuel knew, was Yoshin, and so was Carlo, who was from Kroog's river wards. Samuel looked to Carlo and saw he had built a bloodless look of fear and worry falling over him. Samuel put a hand on his back, hoping to steady him. Thanks, Carlo said quietly. The city guard and Kroog's garrison have drawn a defensive line around the capital district, Thanos continued. Evacuations of the other districts are underway. Does that mean we've given up the city? Carlo said, voice wavering. What about the river wards? It means we're defending what we can, Thanos said, ignoring Carlo's second question. But standing in one place isn't going to win us the day, which is where you and your new Avengers come in. We're going to mount a counterattack to buy the evacuations more time. Thanos motioned to Laura, who hefted a long crate onto the middle of the group. She levered the crate open, revealing 4 command rods packed in a straw. Each of you take one and pair up, Laura said. Samuel, you stick with sword 1. She passed Samuel an empty holster. We need you and your Avengers to take down the dragon engines, Thanos said. Once the engines are down, we stand a chance to drive Mishra's forces back. Samuel listened to Thanos' briefing as he belted the holster on. The command rod fit snugly in the leather scabbard. That moment made this moment real, Samuel realized. He looked to the other cadets, pilots, and watched them pair up with their Avengers. Rika took 2, Carlo 3, the others were from a different year, the one just after Samuel's and unfamiliar to him. They paired with 4 and 5. Good, Thanos said, when all the pilots were paired. I have to go, but I've given instructions here to Laura for your deployment. He looked to the 5 pilots, hesitating. We'll have soldiers escort you, so don't worry about being exposed to the fighting, Thanos said. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been shouting, even though all he did was talk. With these Avengers, visual range will do. Anything you say in the command rod, they'll be able to pick up. Don't get too close. Aim with the rod and remember to say, behind your escorts. Good luck, cadets. Thanos said pilots. He corrected. Good luck, pilots. Stay safe. And if you're in danger, don't think, just run. Henge, in the east, is where I have been told the army will gather. Thanos' face was a pale mask, graying as if wounded. Samuel searched for the optimism that usually animated Thanos, but did not find it. A bolt of worry bittered his gut. Thanos was afraid. Calm and steady Thanos, the one who came to mess and laughed with the cadets. He was afraid. He couldn't even look at them. Worry curdled to fear. A little fear that gnawed at him. How bad was it out there really? A sudden snap of adrenaline and Samuel flinched, moving to raise his hand as if he were still in class. Master Thanos, sir, Samuel asked. My younger brother Randall. He's a cadet in the Ornithopter course, stationed at the palace. Randall, Thanos said, frowning. I might know him, but don't worry. All of our Thopters are deployed with Ursa's forces elsewhere or about to depart, Thanos said. If he's in the Thopter corps, he'll be out there soon enough. Samuel exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He did not have enough time to thank Thanos though, as a sudden and tremendous explosion roared up from the far side of the city along the Mardoon, where the fighting was heaviest. The commotion in the ornery yard stopped as everyone turned to look, even Thanos and Laura, at the distant calamity. Roiling, crimson smoke leapt into the sky. A whole block of the city rippled with fire. Samuel could see a darker shape moving to the center of that rising blaze, a conflagration so great that flames swallowed the tops of the bell towers that remained standing. They crumbled as the dark shape moved and another roar split the sky, a gout of smoke and fire lancing through the blocks along the Mardoon. A dragon engine. Thanos cursed. He pressed the small order scroll into Laura's hands, with instructions to give them to the captain at their posts. He left the yard with a quick salute to the pilots, hurrying just short of running. Right, Laura said, watching him go. Let's get moving. double quick, Avengers Online and Vigilant. Samuel noticed that Laura had belted on a sword at some point during Thanos' briefing. As a unit, the 5 pilots and their Avengers filed out of the yard. Samuel looked back over his shoulder as they departed. Behind, crews hurried to repurpose the transport sledges to haul any goods, materials, chassis and supplies they could fit. They were preparing to evacuate the ornery. A shout from Laura. Samuel was following behind. "With me, one," Samuel said to his Avenger. Together the two of them hurried to catch up with the rest of the pilots as they moved down the city. Kroog was burning and people choked her streets, fleeing the fire. Samuel couldn't stop thinking about festival days, where competing parades to the many gods of Yotia snarled the white brick boulevards and cheering crowds thronged in the side streets. The ringing of festival bells crashed and clamored through the city, a high and bright sound of chaotic joy that propelled and intertwined with the music that filled the air. Samuel had been overwhelmed during his first festival season in Kroog, but the second year in the city, he fell in love with it. Far from the ponderous ceremonies in Argive, the festivals in Kroog and across Yotia were ebullient, alive. Never in his young life had Samuel lived in a place where the gods were so close, and never did he imagine himself becoming someone who loved that proximity. But today, in the blood-slick, red brick streets, the gods felt quite distant. This day was a dark mirror to those celebration days, and each block the pilots advanced plunged them deeper into that horrible mirror. The ringing bells today were the same bells that tolled on celebration days, only now they screamed. "Listen," Laura commanded Samuel and the rest of the pilots. "Stay close and order your Avengers to do the same. They will avoid civilians better if you let them navigate the crowd on their own. You focus on staying close to me." Laura and the pilots hurried through the city streets, shoving their way through the fleeing crowds as they made for the northern district. Samuel labored under the weight of his pilot kit, donned in haste that morning. Not 2 blocks into the city proper and his jumpsuit was soaked through with sweat under the light cuirass. The satchels he carried, spare power stones for Sword 1, a brace of tools, small and delicate replacement parts, together felt like an anvil's weight across his shoulders. The few encouraging shouts Samuel registered from the general pandemonium did nothing to hearten him. To the contrary, they seemed to thin and hopeless cries. There was a second, lower tone bubbling through the shoving and rushing crowds, a more terrible fear under their immediate panic. This was not just an attack, this was the beginning of a war, and they were losing it. Kroog might die, and with it, all Yotia. The closer they got to the northern districts, the thinner the crowds were, and the louder the sound of fighting. Fewer bells rang here, but they were still audible, echoing in from the other districts still hurrying to evacuate. The closer the pilots came to the northern district, the more bodies they came across as well. At first, they were the crumpled forms of people who had been trampled in the nearly rush to flee. By the time the pirates reached their rendezvous point, they started to encounter the bloody and burned dead soldiers and civilians both. "Hold here, pilots," Laura shouted, calling them to a halt. The 5 pilots and their Avengers came to a stop in an abandoned market plaza. Overturned stalls and stands scattered bright sprays of spices, fruits and vegetables across the ground. A small fire licked the charred ruins of a storefront where a food seller's cart had tipped over, spilling hot coals into the shop's dry interior. People had fled in the middle of their morning routines, leaving everything behind. At the far end of the plaza was a hasty but substantial barricade, defended by at least 24 Yotian soldiers, soot-stained and bloodied after retaking the plaza. The barricade would not hold off a dragon engine, but it would deter any human soldiers from attacking. The Yotian squadron looked at the Avengers with hope, and their pilots with concern. Samuel tried not to look at the pile of dead Yotians, civilians and soldiers both, that lay in a heap next to the small fountain at the center of the square. Debris fluttered in the hot wind stirred up by the raging fires. A scatter of dead Valaji troopers splayed out unceremoniously on the far end of the plaza, arrow shafts sticking from their bodies. Laura talked with the ranking officer there, a lieutenant by his stripes. The Captain Thanos had assigned the pilots to had been killed. Samuel figured the lieutenant to only be a year or so older than he. though it was hard to tell under his heavy armor. Sunwell overheard the lieutenant say that this had been a second-line medical post before a bitter fight contested the small plaza. The Yoshians now planned to use the plaza as a staging ground for the counterattack. Stacks of firebombs, arrows and darts stood near the barricade. Occasionally, a runner would come sprinting into the square, haggle with the supply officer and then run back with a bundle of firebombs tossed over their shoulder or a healer in tow. "Pilot Sanwell," Laura called, waving him over. "Sanwell, this is Lieutenant Marcos." Laura's introduction was drowned out by a loud roar enough to send everyone in the plaza diving for cover. A long, buzzing series of explosions followed moments later, reports echoing over the city. The bells nearby fell silent. Sanwell and the rest of the pilots, Laura included, stayed prone, their avengers watching over them. Some of the soldiers pushed themselves to their feet, gathering up their spears and adjusting their sword belts, peering over the barricade, crawling back to their posts. The brick was dry and hot. Sanwell clutched the control rod to his chest. The thumping of his heart against the ground matched the rumbling of the nearby dragon engine on the move. The bells began to ring again and Laura stood, hollering at the pilots to get up. Lieutenant Marcos bellowed at the rest of the soldiers to get up to the walls. Sanwell stood on trembling legs, helped up by Rika and Carlo. The two younger pilots stuck close to Laura and had already sent their avengers to the barricade. Big booming explosions crashed through the plaza, sending whistling and skittering shards of metal into the air. Sanwell flinched as a chip of plaza brick leapt up and cut his cheek, flung into him by something pinging off the ground as it flashed past him. Shrapnel, the Falaji were attacking. Sanwell, rooted to the spot, watched as Yoshian soldiers hurled firebombs over the barricades toward the charging unseen Falaji. Smoke and bright flashes followed, explosions thundering and echoing off the storefronts, raining glass and clouds of dust on the street opposite the barricade. Screams mixed with the crying of charging Falaji as they returned fire, launching heavy crossbow bolts and whistling arrows at the Yoshians. Sanwell ducked just in time behind Sword One's extended arm, cringing at every whining ping that rattled off the Avenger's armor. Above it all loomed the dragon engine, Mishra's engine. Sanwell saw through the smoke the heat-warped visage of the titanic machine. Reptilian, a beast of artifice and war towering high above the building tops of the northern district. It roared, hungry, cruel, alive, and advanced toward them, shrouded once more in the thick smoke. "Sanwell," Laura shouted to be heard over the cacophony of combat. "Take Rika and Carlo down that side street," she ordered, pointing with a sword down a narrow alleyway. "Find a way to flank the engine and bring it down, pilot." "Yes, ma'am," Sanwell saluted. He started to ask for more direction, but Laura had already hurried toward the wall, a bandolier of firebombs thrown over her shoulders. "Get your swords," Sanwell said to Rika and Carlo. "Let's go kill a dragon." Sanwell led the charge down the side street, following Sword 1. Rika and Carlo followed behind, swords 2 and 3 in the tow. The sound of battle at the plaza barricade surely gave their movement some cover. They moved quickly, not quietly. They made it halfway down the alley before the dragon engine fired a blast into the plaza behind them. A roar like the sky splitting open, a rippling crescendo of explosions. The boiling red mist scoured the plaza, blasting apart the Yoshian barricade and incinerating its defenders. Sanwell, Rika and Carlo turned, looking on in horror as the crimson blast swept across their narrow view of the plaza. Laura and the other pilots, Lieutenant Marcos and their soldiers, gone in a breath. The smoke lingered, not moving despite the stinking, howling furnace blast wind. The air itself sizzled, writhed in pain, crackled with heat-tortured bolts of lightning. A body staggered into the alleyway from the burning plaza. None of the pilots could tell who it was. The poor soldier bounced off the alley wall, stumbling like a drunk, and collapsed, shattering into ash where they hit the ground. All thoughts of revenge and glory quit Sanwell then. Worry stopped gnawing and started consuming. The plaza echoed with the sound of charging boots. Soldiers emerged from the boiling smoke, helms slammed shut against the burning air. Their anti-mech spears raced towards swords 4 and 5, their pilots gone. Blasted and heat-warped by the dragon engine's burning breath, the machines nevertheless held their ground, swords flashing. A handful of soldiers died, but the Avengers were torn down to cheers. They had slowed Mishra's engine for a moment, and the greater advance of his forces not at all. A moment, Sanwell remembered the years of training. It brought those other pilots, whose names he never knew, a moment. Carlo started to scream, and neither Sanwell nor Rika could get him to calm down. There was no telling whether the Falaji could hear them, but they couldn't take the risk. Rika tore open a linen bandage from his medical kit and tied it around Carlo's mouth while Sanwell held him steady. The two of them dragged Carlo away into the darkness of the alley, praying that the dragon engine would not follow. Their sword Avengers followed, ash piled on their armored shoulders. Sanwell and Rika, with an alternating mute and screaming Carlo in tow, followed their Avengers through the alley into another small nameless plaza. This one was a crossroads, walled in by 2- and 3-story buildings on all sides. Their alley continued across the plaza. The crossing road was a proper carriageway, wide enough for 3 carts abreast. At one point in the morning, it had been fortified by a barricade on the northern exit from the plaza, blocking access to the rest of the city against anyone approaching from the Mardoon. Now the barricade lay in ruins, Yoshin and Falaji dead splayed across the smoldering wreckage, flies already making meals of them. Stray dogs scurried away when the Avengers and their pilots came running into the plaza. Sanwell and Rika ordered their Avengers to take up watch on the Mardoon side of the crossroads, then staggered to the end of the square opposite the barricade, dragging Carlo with them. His Avengers stood still at the end of the alley, awaiting orders. The 3 of them sat on an overturned cart and caught their breath. The dragon engine hadn't followed, for the moment. In this quiet corner of besieged Kroog, they were safe. "What do we do?" Rika asked. "We can't fight the engine," said Sanwell. "Not even with our swords. We need an army of them to fight that." "So what do we do?" Rika asked again. Sanwell looked back down the alleyway they had just emerged from, back towards the scoured plaza. He looked up at the smoke-darkened sky. The sun, so cleared up by the ordinary, burned a dim, sick orange. Ash drifted down, black and grey. "We run," Sanwell said, "like Thanos told us. If we're in danger, we run." Rika took his own survey of their surroundings. "Where?" The dragon engine bellowed again, deafening, vision shaking. Sanwell and Rika clapped their hands over their ears, eyes watering at the loudness of the roar. It passed, and like thunder from a moving storm, the 2 boys listened for its source. It appeared the dragon engine was moving away from them and their Avengers, making for the heart of the city. "Away," Sanwell said, a little too loud as his hearing slowly came back to him. "Anywhere but here. Didn't Thanos say something about some town, Hinge?" "Henge," Rika corrected. "Some caravan town, I think. A place for horses to get water." "Maybe there," Sanwell said. "We'd have to cross the city," Rika said, chewing his lip. "West might be better. We could run to the western gates and make for the coast. Find a ship." Sanwell hung his head. He thought of his brother, Randall. Was he in the air by now? Where would they send the evacuees? Sanwell asked Rika. "Corliss or Pendragon?" "Corliss is closer," Rika said, "but they're merchants and they're neutral. Besides, they don't have a standing army, just mercenaries. My guess is Pendragon. It's further, but that's where Urza and..." A sudden clatter and a shout sounded from the northern entrance to the crossroads, the Mardoon side where their Avengers stood guard. Sanwell and Rika looked over to see a rank of Falaji brass caps approaching the crossroads. Behind them, Sanwell could see what looked like a forest of pikes under which shone the polished brass helms of a whole marching column of soldiers. "Sanwell," Rika said, standing. He wasn't calling Sanwell's attention, only uttering a reflexive gasp, spoken in disbelief at what he saw. The Falaji army, unimpeded, marching toward them. "Sword 1, Sanwell cried. He stabbed his command rod towards the Falaji and pressed the trigger. A thin beam of light, visible only in the passing smoke, dazzled the front rank of the Bascraps. "Attack!" Sword 1 bounded toward the Falaji, followed a second later by Sword 2. Carlo, catatonic, triggered his control rod, flashing the ground at his feet. Sword 3 did not move, the machine had dropped into an idle sword, ready but not raised. The marching soldiers were unable to form a pike wall before the two Avengers crashed into them. The front ranks died in chaos, their pikes skittering off the Avengers' armor plating. The two Avengers worked their great swords with a butcher's efficiency, grinding the Falaji advance to a halt at the ruined barricade. Sunwell watched in horror and awe as the Avengers cut through the backstraps, the sound of their swords buzzing through the air, the heavy wet thunk of the blades meeting and separating flesh, smashing bone, crunching through the bright Falaji armor as if it were little more than thin foil. Sunwell could only stagger backward, command rod level and aimed, and watch the Avenger interpret his most basic command. Sword 1 cleaved through the soldiers before it with expeditious strikes, short chops, one manipulator holding the hilt of his sword and one along the blade to guide it. Rika piloted 2 with precision, directing his Avenger toward officers and targets that presented a threat to their machines, soldiers with heavy explosive-tipped lances and crossbows, officers with their commanded flags and steady voices. Sword 2, under Rika's command, hunted them through the chaos made by Sword 1's assault. Who taught Sword 1 how to fight? Sunwell stabbed his control rod toward a pair of brass caps who had made it around Sword 1. He triggered the rod, dazzling its beam across the soldiers, and Sword 1 immediately interceded, impaling them both with one heavy lunge. Sword 1 lifted them and swept them off its weapon, sending their bodies tumbling into the still advancing column. At some point, Sword 1 had to learn how to move like that, Sunwell thought, keying another target. He backpedaled, retreating with Rika, dragging Carlo with them, putting distance between them and the fight. Who taught Sword 1 how to interpret his simple first command and translate it into movements Sunwell could not do himself? He had seen inside the older models as part of his training. They, like Sword 1, were not alive, as he understood it. They could not think. They were machines, humanoid assemblies of 1,000 complex calculations and delicate complications, thousands of hours of genius and technical acumen, and human labor set to a single purpose, achieved with uncanny grace, to swing a sword and end a life. Brilliance, madness. Sword 1 ejected his dull blade toward the advancing brass caps, then drew a fresh razor from the magazine on its back. The Avenger moved so smoothly that Samuel could almost believe it was a giant person in armor, a warrior that could not be stopped by fear, pity or fatigue. Spears and crossbow bolts shattered on Sword 1's legs and deflected off its brachial and thoracic armor plates, each glancing blow driving home how indestructible the Avenger was. Another feeling mixing with Samuel's fear, relief that the swords were on his side. An explosion boomed out over Sword 2's upper half, staggering the Avenger into Sword 1. Sword 1 gracefully sidestepped his fellow, and Sword 2 fell back into the plaza, landing hard enough to crack stone. Rika saw, but Samuel saw why. A bomb had blown away 2's right arm. Hydraulic fluids and dark oil sprayed from the damaged equipment, bumping into the air until 2's internal systems shut off the flow, drawing a fresh blade with his remaining arm. Sword 2 struggled back to standing, but it was too late. The gap had been made. The Falaji brass caps advanced, driven by their officers behind, cheering, hoarse, heartened by the blow dealt to Sword 2. Sword 1 tried to intercede but could not hold back the road by itself. At first only a handful of brass caps made it through. Sword 2 tried to drive them back, but the Falaji fired a hail of explosive bolts at its legs and head. The reports boomed on top of each other, pressure waves battering the wounded machine back to the ground. As it fell, soldiers swarmed Sword 2, stabbing bomb pikes into its joints and between its armor plates, arresting its movement. On the other side of the yard, more brass caps brought the idle Sword 3 to the ground, anti-mech pikes stabbing and slicing vital internals, joints and mechanisms. Samuel screamed something wordless, a mix of horror and fury, stabbing his command rod at the Falaji, stabbing a dazzling beam at them again and again. No commands, nothing from his training, just giving voice to raw panic as the enemy flooded into the crossroads. Sword 1 fought on, as it was designed to do. The brass caps detonated their bomb lances and killed Sword 2. The Avenger's Power Stone erupted, a bright flash that blanked the square with white light. Senwell went flying, blinded by the blast. Somehow, he held on to his command rod, and as he lay on his back, he blinked his vision back from burnt to blurry. He could see Carlo laying still, near the overturned cart, uniform smoldering. He watched Rika push himself to his feet, his cheekbones and nose raw and burnt. A sandpaper wind whipped through the streets of Kroog, scouring Senwell's own burnt face and hands. He cried out in pain, voice muffled as his hearing was slow to return. The bell still crashed and rang. Other explosions thumped throughout the city. Distant screams. Distant, the roar of dragon engines. Senwell's world was a haze of cloudy grey smoke under an ochre sky. The sun above was a dying marigold, fat and close, threatening to slip from the sky. An egg yolk sloughed from his white. Everything stank of burning wood, oil, flesh. Ash fell like snow. When Senwell was new to Kroog, dispatched with his brother as a child to learn artifice at the ornery, he'd been schooled in Yoshian custom and belief. Cultural education, his parents told him, necessary for any child of the East, for the young science of civilization to understand the world they were destined to rule. In this education, Senwell learned that of the many gods of Yoshia and their domains, no single one ruled over an underworld of accursed afterlife. A human soul was too myriad to be thrown into hell on the word of one god. Damnation for the Yoshians was not that simple. One had many souls throughout the course of their life, and each of them was afforded its own judgment. Senwell knew now that the Yoshians had missed an aspect. They had forgotten a god somewhere in their celebrations, the one who damned his living soul to the city of hell. Senwell imagined that morbid deity flying above the city on torn wings, belching crimson mist down into the burning streets. Sword 1, Senwell whispered into the command rod. To me, be it hell or nightmare, Senwell wanted out. Dark shapes stalked through the haze, though none got the reassuring profile of Sword 1. Lumpen silhouettes bent over their long spears, white helms turning slowly. Listening, searching. Senwell moved up to a crouch, slipping further back from the moving shapes. He padded past Rika and hissed for him to follow. Rika shook his head and held a finger to his lips. He pointed, directing Senwell's gaze. Carlo. He crawled towards Senwell and Rika. The burns across his back and legs were terrible, rendering him into a mess of blistering flesh and melted steel. Son? Carlo cried, sobbing. Rika? Rika started toward Carlo, but Senwell grabbed him and shoved him back. The dark shapes in the brick haze stopped, listening. Their broad heads turned. Their spears probed the gently falling ash. Where are you guys? Carlo cried again. A flurry of crossbow bolts thudded into Carlo's back, killing him. A second volley peppered him seconds later, stray bolts pinging and ricocheting off the ash-covered ground. The brass caps shouted, calling to each other the location of the dead pilot. Sword 1, kill! Senwell shouted into his command rod, his voice cracking. Kill! Rika turned, grabbed Senwell and shoved him into a run. Over his shoulder, Senwell heard Valaji soldiers screaming in terror under the rising whine of a laboring, wounded machine. He turned, backpedaling for 3 short steps, and saw Sword 1's tall, armored form rising from the darkness. Sword 1 was a heat-warped knight in yolk yellow light. Golden death, splattered with soot and ash. Though horribly wounded, Sword 1 was not dead, and until it was, it would obey Senwell's last order. Blood-spattered, fearless, the terrible machine may have been another forgotten Yoshian god, that of war and the crossroads, of machines and the age to come. Senwell threw down his control rod. There was nothing left to command. Sen, Rika's hands clawed at Senwell's collar, the other boy trying to pull him along. Senwell stumbled but did not fall. Together the 2 boys ran. Kroog died on a crimson morning. The war began at sunrise. Ayman lay on his back and squinted against the one light of the marigold sun. The sky was a foul orange tint, deep as the burnt brown of a charred pepper where smoke from still burning fires belched. Everything stank, beauty curled by death. Sweet azure sky rusted over, Bright bells twisted to screaming. Ayman needed water. The thudding thunder of nail-bottomed boots. A stampede of boots. Hundreds, thousands, a million. The whole of the world running by him. One kicked his head hard enough to tumble him over, as the waves one did. Argivian or Valachi he could not tell. The strap of his breast cap snapped and his helm bounced away. Some reinforcements, he thought, running to battle. To battle. Kroog, burning city, invader city, the city of thieves. Why were they here? Mishra the snake tongue. Hungry, jealous. The cater's greed. Ayman needed water. He groaned and tried to move, but when he tried to sit up, all strength drained from him. He coughed, wincing at the pain. He couldn't see. He looked down at his body. Ayman let slip a weak cry of fear and shock. 3 arrows, he'd been hit. One in his upper thigh, one pinning his arm to his chest, and another through his side. Thigh was the deepest, right in the meat. Arm was all the way through, but his arm and breastplate underneath had stopped the arrow from wounding him deeper. Side was little more than a deep cut, trapped in his armor and padded cloth underneath. Once the arrow was gone, a clean bandage would be enough. His face dropped, and the horrible split feeling told him he had been wounded there as well. Ayman dropped back down. "I need water," Ayman called out. "Water," he cried, and realized his was only one of many voices adding to a chorus of pain, weeping, screaming, wounded. He looked around, lucidity coming back with the pain. He was in hell. Bodies packed the space between the buildings, filling the road where they had fought, the gullet of the city, through which soldiers of both kingdoms were ground into meat. He tried to remember what happened. Some huge golden knight, some bright machine of terror. The column marching forward, shoved by the rear ranks, terrified of death, ahead, and Mishra's officers behind. Explosions, pain, the boats before that, his hands shaking, the quiet prayer of the soldier next to him, the cold of the river as they charged up the banks, the screams. Ayman needed water. He needed to get away. Hands grabbed at him and the dead man moaned in his ear, begging him for his mother. Ayman slapped the hands away with his good arm, gasping for breath. He kicked and scraped, scooting away from the bleeding corpse. Wheezing, Ayman crawled, yelping where the arrow shafts stabbed and dragged over the brick. He collapsed against the side of the alley, shaking violently. Vision, graying, water. He was dying. Burning. Deep pain throbbed through his leg, his eye, his side. Ayman woke up. It was nighttime. He had passed out. The alley was silent. The dead draped over every surface. Fires lit the night, casting everything in its own pit. Ochre glow. No more bells rang, though Ayman could hear the battle still raging in the distant quarters of Kroog. Ayman moaned when he saw it. A ghost. A revenant, glowing a soft blue as it picked across the fetid alleyway. Ayman started to pray. The ghost looked over at him. Ayman's prayer caught in his throat. The ghost walked toward him, dim blue form tracing an echo through the hot evening air behind it. Death. Ayman knew it. This was death, claiming souls to journey with him. Death crouched above a horribly wounded man. The man's chest rose and fell, hitched, and then deflated. Ayman could hear the rattle from where he hid. Death stood, his head dragged across the alley, as if taking in the sight. A harvest, Ayman thought, a harvest for this cold reaper. Not yet, Death said. He spoke to the empty valley, but Ayman knew Death spoke to him. Death had a strange accent, like something from the Far East. As a boy, Ayman had tended his father's trading ship, sailing all around the bounds of Terishare. Pendragon's austere harbor had been a regular enough stop, and Ayman had picked up some Argivian. Death's language sounded familiar. "We're too early," Death said. "We're years away, decades at least. It doesn't happen here." Relief and confusion flooded through him. Ayman let himself hope. Death sighed, and then Death disappeared. 2 weeks later, Ayman's fever finally broke. He limped out of the airy medical tent, the right side of his body aching and itching, but healing. He had lost an eye. Save for that wound, he would suffer no more than puckered scars where the arrows had pierced him. The dry desert breeze cooled the sweat on his brow. Ayman's war was done. His life, he knew for certain, was only beginning. He looked up at the pale blue sky, tracked thin clouds in their heights, and watched the birds wheeling. Death had told him, not today. Not yet, actually.